Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today, I have a special guest. He is Pastor Joshua Schooping. He colloquized out of the Orthodox communion into the LCMS by way of a general Protestant denomination. And today we're going to discuss kind of what his story is, what was compelling about Protestantism in general, and then Lutheranism in particular, and what he found lacking within the Orthodox communion that he found shining brightly within the Lutheran Church. So welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, Joshua.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jason, for having me on. It really is an honor. Thank you.
Well, it's a great joy to finally connect. We've been actually trying to put this together for some time now, and just schedules and other things have gotten in the way. But super excited about being able to dive into this. So, just kind of first off, what's the story? How long did it take? Was it an aha moment like we read about with Luther in the Tower, or was it just kind of a general ongoing, you had questions that you found answers to in other denominations?
Yeah, that's a good question. And before I forget, Pastor Marcus Williams sends his greeting to you.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, he's a great man.
Yes, I love him very much. So it started off, I suppose, with some niggling doubts that began as early as seminary for me while at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York. And when a person enters into the Eastern Orthodox Church, it can be an incredibly diverse experience depending on who the priest is, or who the priests are, or depending on the local community, which jurisdiction you're in, what the culture of that jurisdiction or that local church is. I read my way in many ways into the Eastern Church by reading such mystical texts like the Filioque, or Vladimir Lossky's The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, Dionysius the Areopagite, his mystical theology, and things of that sort, Dumitru Staniloae. And the general impression that was often given to me, which nobody minds you having and no one will necessarily disabuse you of, is that the Orthodox Church is just the unchanged church. And they are just kind of doing things the way they've always done it, and they didn't change the doctrines, and the Western Church changed the doctrines. They changed the creed. They, Augustine and the Filioque and the legalism of the Western versions of the atonement. And the Eastern Church is very mystical, not scholastic, not even necessarily oriented towards a real strong commitment to systematic theology. And so you have this kind of, or at least I kind of received this impression of this kind of unchanging edifice of the church. And I remember being in liturgical theology, and I had a very good professor there who I really cared for a lot, actually. Dr. Meyendorf, which was Father John Meyendorf's son. Excellent professor. I remember there was one of the classes he was discussing the liturgy of death. It had kind of brought me to tears. But during some of the historical portions of the study, starting to kind of get into original source material and the actual history, and going kind of through the, I don't want to say century by century, but, looking through some of the unfolding blocks of time, it was made absolutely undeniably clear that, well, the liturgy as St. John Chrysostom would have celebrated is not like the way it's celebrated today. Certainly there would be some echoes, some similarities, but even things like the iconostas, where the icons are in the front and create this like kind of large screen, if not barrier, between the nave and the altar area, like wasn't there at the time. A lot of the hymnology was from like 9th or 10th centuries, and with various other things, not to mention just icons themselves being an established part of the church. And so I remember through some of those classes, like my stomach dropping, because one of the key selling features of the Eastern Orthodox Church is its, at least today, as people claim, is its unchanging nature. That if you got into a time machine and you worshipped with essentially Athanasius or with St. John Chrysostom or St. John of Damascus, and so on to St. Gregory Palamas, it would essentially be the same liturgy. And there's a lot of wiggle room in that word, essentially the same, because there are some profound differences.
It carries a lot of weight, that word.
It does, yeah. And when I realized that it was kind of a sophism, it was very disheartening. And so even though I do find the Eastern liturgical rite very beautiful in its ceremony, it's not. It doesn't have that same. It really can't make that claim. It is a highly developed liturgy that isn't, quote unquote, original with the apostles in all of its ceremonial features. But I think one of the things that really caused some more profound doubt, I think, because that one was more manageable, I'll say. But one of the ones that caused some more profound doubt for me was the doctrine of the atonement and the idea that the West sort of invented the idea of, the satisfaction of God's wrath, or a forensic dimension to the atonement, or the idea of a substitutionary atonement that involves Christ suffering the penalty for sin in order to satisfy the eternal demands of justice. And that's another thing that if you are entering into Eastern Orthodoxy, whether you're there for 1 year or 50 years, no one will necessarily tell you that that's actually not a true impression. That actually the church fathers taught penal substitutionary atonement or vicarious satisfaction, use either term, that these teachings go all the way back to church fathers like John Chrysostom, like St. Cyril of Alexandria, to St. Simeon, the new theologian. And St. Simeon, the new theologian, was considered a mystic par excellence. So it kind of gave it kind of opened my eyes, I'll say, to the fact that the Eastern concept of mysticism being opposed to the legal dimensions of God's divine law was false. To oppose those two were false. And it was such a pervasive teaching in wherever I would go in the Eastern Church, whether in seminary or after seminary, that it really gave me a very strong doubt as to what is it that these people think that Eastern Orthodoxy is when they tell it to us, because they don't mind telling us things that get us into their church, that stoke the flame of dissatisfaction with the Western churches. They don't mind stoking that and always portraying themselves as, the alternative, more profound, deeper, mystical, etc. church. They don't mind that. And so when you start kind of like, digging into some of these claims and you find that they're false, they always have this, well, we don't go by what one father says. Well, what happens when two fathers say it? Well, we don't go by just what two fathers say. Or, well, what happens when 5 fathers say it over the course of 5 centuries and you find it in a ecumenical council? Well, then I kind of started finding out that they didn't even care then. They would love to make the claim that they're the church of the councils, but when push came to shove, they would even reject ecumenical councils. Like, for example, in the 7th Ecumenical Council, when they anathematize anyone who refuses to venerate icons. we have to remember that when they defend the use of icons or the presence of icons, that it's not a matter of freedom for them. They say if you don't venerate them, which means bowing and kissing with strong desire, that's how it's worded in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, then you are accursed, you are anathematized, which means you're going to hell. And so they say, many modern Orthodox will say, oh, no, we don't necessarily think that, anathema means that, you're going to hell. It's a medicinal thing, because we're the medicinal church. We're not the legalistic church like the West. But then when you actually read what the Ecumenical Council says, what the Seventh Ecumenical Council says about what anathema means, it means precisely you're outside of the church, and it says you're going to Gehenna, where the fire does not die, and is never quenched. And so, I would start to kind of find this fair weather patristic theology, where they would kind of pick and choose as they liked, and I would get very, very frustrated with this, because I would kind of get to the point where it's like, well, what do we actually believe? Like, how do I determine between what we say at the popular level and what we know at the level of scholarship? Like, what is it that we actually teach? Because I could go and find a book named, Thinking Orthodox, or a New Orthodox Catechism by, priest so-and-so, or priest this and that. And they'll say different things, and they'll say different things than what the church fathers say. They'll say different things than what the ecumenical councils say. They'll quote an ecumenical council, they'll quote a church father, but it'll be like a strategic use of silence regarding many of the things that the Eastern Orthodox use. And so I got kind of fed up to the point, and this is like this burgeoning doubt in me, after discovering penal substitutionary atonement in the church fathers, I started to say, well, I want to teach what the Eastern Church canonically teaches. What do we believe, teach, and confess at the formal, official level? Not just what my priest says, not just what my friend who's a priest says, not just what contemporary priests say, not just what this popular bishop, writes. But what are we actually bound to believe, teach, and confess? And so I start going into canonical material from councils. And so I found, now through a lot of this, I'm already kind of discovering the sort of fake apologetics that Eastern Orthodox always throw up, impressionistic apologetics against Protestant claims. So they'll say Reformed teach this, they'll say Lutherans teach that. And then I invariably found that they would misrepresent confessional Protestants. And I'm developing my library of, confessional Protestant material at this time and checking their claims. And so, I'm going to go check Eastern Orthodox confessional claims. And so I go to the Jerusalem Council of 1672, which on the face of it wasn't an ecumenical council. And so a lot of phony Eastern Orthodox apologists will say, oh, well, that's not binding because it wasn't an ecumenical council. Well, because it's not an ecumenical council on the front of it doesn't actually mean it's not ecumenically binding or universally binding on the church. And you will find honest Orthodox apologists admitting this. And because when the decrees went out, when the council acts and decisions went out, it was universally received in the Orthodox Church. That means all of the patriarchates submitted to its authority. And so that means it becomes binding on all those who are underneath those patriarchs, all the metropolitans, all the bishops. It becomes de facto, I don't want to say through a back door, but through a side door, it becomes de facto ecumenical. And I would ask my question, do we affirm it or do we not? And we have to say yes, because as a priest, I had no authority to differ from it. So I had to teach it. And so as I'm getting down to the doctrine of justification, I'm fully persuaded at this point that we're justified by faith apart from any works, and that it's the righteousness of Christ that justifies me, not my righteousness. It's not the power of my believing and the power of enacting my faith through works that justifies me before our holy God. And I'm reading through in order to teach, and I even republished the decrees of Dositheus, and it says in there that we are not. Well, let me first back up and say that what the decrees of Jerusalem 1672 are responding to are the confession of faith of Cyril Lucaris. And Cyril Lucaris wrote a confession of faith in which he said, I happen to have it handy, he says that we're justified by, quote, the correlative or object of faith, which is the righteousness of Christ. In other words, it's the very righteousness of Christ that is what justifies us. So the correlative of faith is the righteousness of Christ. Mm-hmm. And then in Decree 13, the same decree that responds to this by Dositheus, that's universally binding in the church, this is kind of my aha moment, where Dositheus says, we rather believe, instead of what Cyril Lucaris just said, we rather believe that it is not the correlative of faith that justifies us, but the faith which is in us. In other words, our own individual personal power of believing, the faith which is in us justifies through works, it says. And then he says, we regard works not as witnesses certifying our calling, but as being fruits in themselves, which become, through which faith becomes efficacious. And so we have, when I'm reading that, I'm, to say my stomach is dropping is an understatement, because I found that they were actually formally at the official level, not what this priest says, not what that saint says, not what this church father says, but the very means by which the Eastern Orthodox Church establishes itself in its claim as the true church at this level of conciliar agreement that was even affirmed at a council later. This council decision was affirmed later. This council was even affirmed at the Council of Crete in the 20th century. It's never been questioned, never been doubted. At that level, they rejected formally the gospel. And I said, I can't. I'm done.
And that led you into, so what happens then? You just say, I quit? Or, you're looking for a new church, right?
Yeah. So I'm persuaded by the doctrine that we are justified by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And then even as a patristic principle, it's very easy to find the doctrine of sola scriptura rightly understood. Not solo scriptura, but sola scriptura. And so I'm actually quite confident about my faith. I'll say it this way. Like it didn't throw me into like a perplexity and doubt about Christ, about the church, about anything. It was actually a very settled certitude. And because of my encounter, my confrontation with the official formal documents of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and by the way, these sorts of canons and councils aren't really studied in any class at seminary. I always think it's funny and sad and tragic when internet cowboys say, oh, that stuff is all obvious. Everybody knows that. Anybody who was, Eastern Orthodox for a day knows everything about the Council of Jerusalem from 1672. I always find those kind of boastful words laughable if they weren't so sincere. But having gone through, these finer points of detail in the confessions of faith, I knew I needed to leave the Eastern Orthodox Church, to remain, in good conscience and, to have any kind of integrity. But I, at the same time, knew that committing to a confession of faith is a pretty big deal. It's a pretty weighty thing. And so I'm leaving because of a confession. And so I didn't want to jump straight away into a a church that had such a strong confessional position because I didn't want to be impatient or rash. I wanted to think through it, but I'm very, clear and settled on the doctrines of justification by faith alone, through grace alone. Like our standard Protestant sort of position in regards to these things that many would, or any probably would agree with us on if they deserve the name Protestant. And so I was in a quandary of where to go. And so I ended up discovering through a friend of mine who was also a former Eastern Orthodox priest. He ended up finding a home for a time. He's actually currently in the Anglican Church right now. He said, well, why don't you talk to a friend of mine who went to seminary, who is a pastor in the Christian and Missionary Alliance? Look into them. And so I look into them and I find out that the founder believed in real presence, the real physical presence even of Christ in the Eucharist. I say, okay, well, that is a commitment that I have. I have no doubts about real presence as a scriptural and historic patristic lowercase c Catholic doctrine. And so I don't really have to jettison this or other kinds of doctrines that I hold firm to this day. And so I felt like I could go there with a very clean conscience and with integrity. And so I went through there honestly, it's a fairly rigorous process of examinations and questions and multiple interviews with multiple, what's the equivalent, I guess, of a district president there. They call them district superintendents. Had to take a course online through their seminary, which was a live interactive course with a professor, and had to work through a lot of things in order to be approved. And they were gracious towards me, and so through their rigorous process of examination, they said, we'd love to have you serve as a pastor here. They knew where I came from. They knew the difficulties. I was very open and transparent with them about that. And so they welcomed me into their church as a pastor. And the local congregation, who I love to this day, and I'm still friends with many of those people, also knew my situation. There was nothing secret or underhanded. I've seen people comment on the internet, like, oh, pastors shouldn't colloquize, essentially. They don't really understand that the colloquization process is actually far more common than a lot of people really realize. And so I essentially colloquized into their church and continued studying the confessions of faith of the major Protestant traditions, whether that was Lutheran or Anglican or Reformed or the various branches of Reformed churches. And so through that process of really a lot of it was healing, kind of a decompressing from the difficulties of the Eastern Orthodox communion, which has difficulties other than just the doctrinal ones. But and even through the friendship of Pastor Marcus Williams, patiently answering my questions and discussing with me and examining with me and going through these and also pastors and theologians from the other traditions and doing just deep dive studies into these things. The confession of the Lutheran Church was just heads and shoulders above any of the others, in my opinion, in terms of its orthodoxy, in terms of its rootedness in patristic and Catholic theology. And so it just kind of became clear. One of the biggest hesitations I had to leave was because the Christian and Missionary Alliance where I was because at the time they did not ordain women into the church, and that's obviously women shouldn't be ordained as pastors. It's not scriptural, and so they maintained that. But at a certain point, they actually changed their doctrine to be able to ordain women as pastors in their denomination. And that is really one of the things that precipitated the timing of leaving with the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church. So it wasn't just a I ate some bad chilies and wanted to get up and leave. It was another issue of conscience, because unfortunately, and this is one of the problems of non-confessional churches and low evangelical churches, is they really struggle to be able to maintain confessional theological integrity. Not to mention orthopraxy, right practice, because they don't really even know what that is.
Right.
And so, through this process, God was very gracious. Many of the timings that worked out with a lot of this were very providential. And so going through, the examination process with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which again is fairly rigorous, multiple levels of interviews, and testing and questioning and cross-examining, they felt that, it was truly a settling into the full expression, I would say, of, if you'll permit the phrase, the Augsburg Catholic faith, the true faith. And so I've been, never more happy and grateful to be anywhere than I am to be in the Confessional Lutheran Church in our Missouri Synod.
Yeah. Well, we're super glad to have you. You mentioned that as you were kind of going through seminary and as you had some of these unfolding doubts, first about the, I don't want to say genuineness, but about the unchanging nature of the liturgy. And then secondly, on a particular view of the atonement, as well as understanding what justification is. Is it fair to say that you were presented with this? It was an idyllic and an ideal way of worship and understanding things that was just kind of beyond the West's understanding, and that we really have kind of the real goods, but it was never explained what those goods were.
Could you rephrase that for me? I want to make sure I'm catching your meaning.
Well, it just kind of sounded like how you were describing these things happening is that they knew what they didn't agree with, but they wouldn't actually put forward what they did say was proper, or that they wouldn't. You
mean like
they didn't
theologically in the Eastern Orthodox Church?
Yes, theologically. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, that there was an unwillingness there was a willingness to say we're not that, but this is what we really are.
In a lot of cases, yes. There's actually a kind of cacophony in my experience in terms of what you'll find in the Eastern Orthodox Church being taught or confessed. You'll have some that will be very, very confident. They'll be very confident personalities. And so they might take very strong, clear moral positions in the church, and so it'll be very conservative in that way. And they might select certain church fathers and kind of really lean into that. So they don't necessarily play the ambiguity card, I think, at that kind of level. Like you might find in like a low evangelical church, like a much squishier kind of approach to theology, because it's just what this pastor teaches or what this Bible, small group leader teaches. And it can have like a diversity of kind of personal opinion. But usually in the East, they'll try to couch everything as like, quote unquote, the fathers say, quote unquote, the canons say. And so they lend everything this air of authority that sounds like it stretches back beyond the imagination of time kind of thing. It's like centuries or millennia old. But then when you start to dig into it, they're going to take very narrow selections, quotations out of context. And so they'll stand on it very securely, but when you look at it, it's not very secure. And then another priest in another area or another jurisdiction, they're going to kind of take like a slightly different slice of this. So you might find Some Orthodox priests and theologians very sympathetic with Origen, for example. Very sympathetic, maybe even with universalism. And they're going to cite the fathers as Maximus the Confessor may have been a universalist, and Gregory of Nyssa may have been a universalist, and Origen was a universalist. And so you'll have famous Eastern Orthodox people like David Bentley Hart, famously being a universalist. And so he won't quote the canons that condemn universalism in council. And he'll say, oh, well, if you do mention those councils, or those canons from that council, those were only added later to that council. But even though those same anathemas or rejections of universalism were reaffirmed at subsequent councils. So you'll have this kind of swath of this kind of patristic theology, which kind of draws impressionistically from the church fathers. And then you'll have the other ones that are going to be, very into, let's see, I've even found some that were affirming of vicarious satisfaction or penal substitutionary atonement, and they're kind of a minority. But then you'll even have this other group that's called the true Orthodox Church or the genuine Orthodox Church, and they're not even communion with the world Orthodox Church, and they'll share with you their history and why they are the way they are, and they'll affirm every single canon that comes out of any of it, out of any period in the history of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so all of them kind of have their favorite fathers. You'll have the mystics that are drawing from Elder Paisios or Elder Ephraim or Elder Porphyrios, and they'll be like, this is true orthodoxy. These mystical fathers who spend hours and hours and hours in doing the Jesus prayer and practicing hesychasm and nepsis or stillness and watchfulness. And so then you'll have those ones, and they'll quote their authoritative fathers. And so when you kind of try to step back and really kind of get a look at it, it's really a cacophony, and people just kind of find their way through there and really kind of don't spend their time kind of pushing at the edges or boundaries to find out what is the actual shape of our theology. Give me a dogmatic theology. I can give another popular example. There's a famous Eastern Orthodox podcast, I guess, or YouTube channel like Lord of Spirits or whatever. Have you heard of that one?
I have not.
Okay, yeah, and they kind of go through the idea of a similar, not terribly unlike Michael Heiser and his teaching that the Nephilim were the giants, and that was a mixed bloodline sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Well, they'll kind of talk about this in an Eastern Orthodox vein, affirming it and saying, "Oh, this is a patristic view," and they'll cite someone like Irenaeus or Justin Martyr to get their bona fides. But ironically, Seraphim Rose in the 20th century wrote a very large patristic commentary on Genesis, and he showed how that view was rejected in the Eastern Church as not being authentic to the tradition. And so you can have this kind of popular thing that everyone thinks is so super orthodox, Lord of Spirits or whatever, and then you can have another traditionalist say, nope, that there were a couple of fathers who did that, but they're outliers and we don't take their opinion as authoritative or even as valid options today. And so, it's a cacophony in that way.
Mm-hmm. So is there any unifying thing then? Is it just around the liturgy and its practice? Are there any unifying doctrines that span across those particular groups that you spoke of?
That's a really hard question to answer, because we could say that there is a unifying thing around the liturgy, but I'll say this: my alma mater, St. Vladimir's, one of the most famous deans of there was Father Alexander Schmemann. Have you heard of Father Alexander Schmemann?
Yes.
Yeah, he's pretty well known, even outside of Eastern Orthodox circles. And I thought he was more or less universally beloved. But I in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, I brought up his name one time, just assuming that would kind of be a source of agreement. And they pulled me aside and said, "Oh, Father Joshua, Alexander Shmemin, I mean, he was good man, but he was innovator."
Mm.
And some of the things that he innovated were liturgical. So they wouldn't necessarily agree. And, so the Russian Orthodox will sometimes be very critical of Greek Orthodox, sometimes, or the Antiochian ways of serving the liturgy. They'll think it's kind of chaotic and disorderly. So there are aspects of the liturgy that are unifying, but it's not a monolithic or simple source of agreement. I think the most unifying thing that they really have is just their belief that they're the true church. It's just their identity. Like, we're right because we are the Orthodox Church. And so you can say almost anything and put a smattering of the Fathers say or a smattering of the canons say, and as long as you end up in the zone that says the Eastern Orthodox Church is the true church, it'll really get a pass in most areas.
Okay. So besides what you mentioned with regard to the liturgy, and then probably the chief thing that really kind of blew things up, the understanding of the atonement and justification and kind of uncovering all of those things. As you look back, were there other things that were kind of like pebbles in your shoe that were bothersome, but they didn't really rise to the level of really calling your attention to it?
I would say the doctrine of mariology.
Okay.
Or the doctrines within their mariology, because people might be surprised just how far the idea that it's all kind of all of the swelling praises of her that exist out there, it's often explained as flowery, metaphorical praise language. It's like you're not really supposed to take it literally. So, in other words, don't really pay a whole lot of attention to it. It's just supposed to kind of create a devotional aesthetic effect.
Mm.
And
like smoke machines in the evangelical church.
Yeah. Or even like how some Muslims will praise Muhammad. I mean, like to hear how some Muslims praise Muhammad, they heap some of the most amazing sorts of praises on him that go beyond anything normal or natural. Mm-hmm. And so they sort of do this in the Eastern Orthodox Church with Mary, and we can say this happens in the Roman Catholic Church. But the idea that this is kind of metaphorical, it's like, because remember, the Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't want to turn anyone away who's coming to their doors. And they're in a Protestant country, so they're going to constantly find ways of trying to frame it so that it doesn't alienate a Protestant sensibility. Mm-hmm. And so, like we don't really mean it literally, or don't take it like that. It's just kind of a way of, it's just devotional language. Don't worry about it. You'll get used to it. Just give it time, set it aside for now and just be here and let the liturgy work on you. And the liturgy will steep you like tea. And then over time that will wear down your Protestant prejudices. And so they, that like sounds wise. It sounds like they're taking the long view. It sounds like they're being very patient. But they're really hoping that the person will kind of slowly let their guard down and just kind of square the circle and be okay with it. And a lot of people do, because it's human nature. Because you say, I have friends here. I have family here. My children were married in this church. I love this priest. He was here at my funeral. He was here during a bad time, this and that. And so I'm not going to really push against the Mary thing. I'm just going to not really, I'm just going to just let it be. Or maybe they'll even have a mystical experience of Mary, whatever that means. And so they'll slowly kind of get massaged into it. But that was one of the pebbles in my shoe. But it was amazing. One of the things it says in one of so it's important, I think, for people to know, and a lot of people don't know this, because when you quote a hymn from an Eastern Orthodox source, that's used in their liturgy, that's called for formally in their liturgy, it has formal teaching authority in their church, because their hymns don't change. After about 9th, 10th century, there's no changing of hymns. They're all set in stone, and they all have binding dogmatic authority in the church, universal dogmatic authority. So in our hymnals, we can find hymns come and go between various editions of the hymnal. That doesn't happen in the Eastern Church. Those are their dogmatic teaching tools, their hymns.
Okay.
Especially, for the general laity and priests and everybody. It's just like if you can find it in these hymns, then you know that that's what the Eastern Orthodox teaches. Even if it's not found in a father, it being in a hymn, that's good enough. And so in one of their hymns, in the Akathist hymn to the Theotokos, it says to her, and they sing this during Lent, it says, "Hail to Mary, hail acceptable incense of intercession." And then it says, "Hail, propitiation for the whole world."
Whoa.
And it calls for the propitiation. I even had to go back, and of course I'm going to go and look at the Greek, and it has that word, exilasma, the hilasmos, it actually means the propitiation, like the turning away of the wrath of God. And that was one of those pebbles in my shoe, because it was like, wait a second, this isn't flowery language. They actually mean it, because when you read the fathers writing about Mary, they don't soften it. You read Gregory Palamas in his homilies on the Theotokos, on the feasts of Mary. He said she lived in the Holy of Holies from the time she was 3 years old. So she literally lived inside the Holy of Holies in the temple that the priest was only allowed to go in once a year. She lived in there. She was fed by angels, and she would make ascend to heaven, because he said she found a new way to heaven. That's what he says. He says through hesychasm, through stillness, this practice of the way they understand the Jesus prayer. It's not just a pious, helpful prayer. It was actually, like, according to Gregory Palamas, this practice of hesychasm was a way to get to heaven that Mary opened and found. And so she would hear through the curtains of the Holy of Holies the pains and cries of the world. And so she would ascend to heaven, and she brought Jesus down, essentially, to be incarnate in her womb through her supernatural powers of ascending. So it's very clear that this is not metaphorical flowery language, because he's actually explaining what they mean. And when we point out Gregory Palamas, he's not just a lone weirdo father. His theology is essentially the foundation for Eastern Orthodox theology following the 14th and 15th centuries. His theology was the foundation of hesychasm, which were affirmed in councils. So there's really no way around it for their idea of Mary. It's not just like pious exaltation of her, calling her blessed and just kind of going overboard. They actually integrate her into their soteriology, where Gregory Palamas goes so far as to say that even now she serves as the gatekeeper between, like, the unifying principle of heaven and earth, and that no one, not even an angel or anyone, can go to Jesus except by way of Mary. And so that was the mariology was kind of a pebble in my shoe. But then once the blinders started coming off, and I was like, I can't deny that they actually really, really do mean this. That was one. Another one would have been the filioque.
Okay. You hear a lot about that.
And you have two camps in the Eastern Orthodox Church today. One that says well, the filioque doctrine is, it's not so bad, it's not so good, but really the problem, and this is this camp, they say, really the problem is that the West changed the creed. The other camp says the very doctrine itself is blasphemous and heretical nonsense. Now, canonically, it's the latter that is correct. I mean, of course, that's the actual position of the Eastern Orthodox Church. At the Council of Braaten in 1285, they anathematized the concept, the idea, the doctrine of the filioque left, right, and center, as many ways as they could seem to be able to find, in 9 or 10 different ways of saying it. They're condemning the idea or concept of the filioque. And they've anathematized it so many times and reaffirmed the anathema of the concept so many times that it's very clear in their canonical history that it's really not so much its presence in the creed, though of course they say that was illegal according to the Canon 7 of the Council of Ephesus in, what was that, 321? Remind me when the Council of Ephesus was.
I don't.
Or 421, this was before, I think it was.
Yeah, I mean, it couldn't have been before Nicaea. So.
Yeah, it would have been. Yeah, I was getting my. When it's 3rd century, it's like 300s, 4th century, 400s. No, when it's 4th century, it's 300s, and I get it all turned around.
Nicaea is 325. Constantinople is 381, and then Ephesus would be what? 431?
431, because it was 20 years prior to Chalcedon in 451.
Yeah.
And then you had the council that was 2 years prior, that was really the start of the Coptic Oriental Orthodox Church in 449. So it's really interesting when you go back to this, because they say that it was illegal for the Eastern Orthodox, for anyone to add to the creed, and they cite Canon 7 from the Council of Ephesus. Okay. And it's really interesting because the real brute fact here is that none of us, neither the East nor the West, confess the Nicene Creed as recited at Nicaea. None of us do. We all recite the Constantinopolitan version, the Constantinopolitan Creed. And that's fine. That's fine. But what people don't really realize is that the Second Ecumenical Council, Constantinople 381, was not an ecumenical council at the time. It was a local council. So by the time we get to 431 in the Third Ecumenical Council at Ephesus, and they say in Canon 7 that you're not allowed to write a new creed, they're specifically mentioning Nicaea, not Constantinople. The language specifically applies to Nicaea because Constantinople, again, wasn't considered an ecumenical council. Constantinople 381 wasn't considered an ecumenical council until 451 at Chalcedon. And so that's a very significant point because there was actually a disagreement, and it had to be affirmed that the Creed of Constantinople was licit, that it was permissible, and it was affirmed as being a distinct creed. So they weren't seeing it as just an identity with the Creed of Nicaea. So what they were saying at Chalcedon 451 is that Constantinople, the Creed of Constantinople, wasn't adding or making a new creed. It was just an expansion of what was already believed there. So expansive language was not illegal. It was not considered illegal in Chalcedon.
So I see where this is going. The filioque is expansive language. Yeah.
The filioque is expansive language, and they've never complained about the West saying very God of very. We say God of God, light of light, very God of very God. In the East, they don't have that doubling of God of God, very God of very God. So they've never criticized for us for having added that to the creed, if you can even call that an addition. But what's really fascinating is that in prior to the Council of Chalcedon, we have of course, 431, we have the Council of Ephesus, but we have in 447, prior to Chalcedon affirming Constantinople, we already have Pope Leo affirming the filioque to a council or to a bishop in Toledo.
Mm-hmm.
And we have Pope Leo affirming the filioque and other bits of his language in his sermons and whatnot that we have today. So Pope Leo is an incredibly pivotal figure for the Council of Chalcedon.
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that when he is affirming the Creed of Nicaea, and when the Creed of Constantinople is being affirmed, he's affirming it with this understanding of the filioque in mind, because that's what that's how he just understood that the Father, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, or the Father and the Son.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we have a person, Leo, already in this position, this really prime position, who's affirmed at 447 Toledo and affirming at 451, and in his writings this concept of the filioque and even the idea of placing it in the creed. It's totally licit. It's totally proper. It's totally fitting. And the West had always sort of just had this understanding, even if it didn't make it into all forms of the creed being recited in the local areas, because they didn't have Xerox machines at the time, right?
Right.
So things would be, each major city would kind of have its form of the creed, and they would recite it, and that was just kind of how it worked at the time. So we have to fast forward all the way to what's his name? The arch schismatic, what do they call him? Photios, the great schismatic in the 9th century. That's where we finally have the filioque considered problematic, was during his generation. And people don't really realize that he actually had a very, very specific motive an opportunity, in terms of like probable cause or whatever, that like a police officer or a lawyer would ever try to kind of like find in someone. He had like all of this probable cause because these kings are murdering each other in succession, and Photios is essentially illegally elected to become a patriarch from a layman over the course of a few days. So he goes from layman to patriarch in a few days, and the patriarch that he was replacing was illegally deposed. And so people sued the patriarch in Rome, the Pope in Rome, and they said, how could this happen? The Pope hears about this, the patriarch in Rome in the 9th century hears about this, and he says, that was totally illegal. Like, you guys can't just like depose a patriarch and then hire a layman, bring a layman on over the course of a week. And I think he was even ordained by a suspended bishop at the time, Photios was. And so they considered and they declared Patriarch Photios's elevation to patriarch as illegal. Now, why was this a problem for the East? It was a problem for the East because Constantinople was in protracted negotiations with the Bulgarians, and they were very dangerous to the Byzantine Empire. And so they were in these negotiations with the Bulgarians, and when they found out that Photios, who now they're treating with, was illegally elevated, and now he's been rejected by the Patriarch in Rome, they suspended negotiations with Constantinople and opened up negotiations with the Patriarch in Rome, with the Pope, with the West. Mm. And so now we have Photios with egg on his face, because he's standing there in the international eyes, he's standing there as an illegitimate pope, as an illegitimate patriarch. And so he either has to agree with Rome or disagree with Rome. If he agrees with Rome, then he loses the negotiations forever. So he has to find dirt on Rome. So he mentions several things, Romans they shave their beards and they use unleavened bread or something, and they added to the creed, and they did something else and something else. And so he starts like this list of like 4, 5, 6 things, and one of them is this thing against the filioque. It's only later in his life that he finally writes this treatise against the filioque. But right then, he just like had this opportunistic moment. And so when he did that, he was able to get enough dirt onto the Romans and reopen and reestablish negotiations with Constantinople, so that Constantinople did eventually secure an agreement with the Bulgarians. And so ever since then, this notion of the filioque was problematized by the East. But it's crazy because you find in Eastern Church fathers like Gregory Palamas, Epiphanius, Maximus the Confessor, you find an affirmation, Cyril of Alexandria, you find an affirmation of the filioque concept. And so that was another thing that was a really big kind of pebble in my shoe over time, was like, what's this big deal about the filioque? And why is it such a problem? And why are some more okay with it and some are less okay with it? And when then I started to look into the actual history, the East have an actually heretical understanding of the Trinity, because they've so deeply anathematized the doctrine of the filioque that they've even alienated themselves from their own church fathers who affirmed it, like Epiphanius and Cyril and Gregory of Nyssa and Maximus the Confessor. So they claim to be this unchanged
discuss any
church.
Of this?
Say that again.
Does Basil discuss any of this?
He is more silent on the issue. You have one kind of apparently strong claim, they say, by Gregory of Nazianzus, that could appear to be contrary to the filioque, but really when you start getting into the language, and there's a gentleman named Crean who wrote a defense of the filioque, looking at the Greek, looking at the Latin and the Latin fathers, and the whole thing makes it, very, very clear how the Eastern Fathers really did teach the filioque as we understand it. We don't violate the monarchia, of the Father, and we don't assert two principles. And even this doctrine that the East has of the real distinction between the essence and the energies is essentially like their attempt at trying to correct some of the problems they create by rejecting the filioque. And what's interesting is that us in the West, we don't really have so much of a problem of distinguishing between the essence and the energies, but the East don't just distinguish between the essence and the energies. They say that there's a real metaphysical distinction between the essence and the energies, and so they actually truly do violate divine simplicity. And also separate and divide the Son and the Holy Spirit by denying that he proceeds from and through the Son. Anyway, that was another one of the kind of things that afterwards was like, oh my goodness gracious, we are so willing to cut off our noses, to spite our faces, to kind of admire and find profundity in the Eastern teachers. And really, we had a very good reason for why we said what we said throughout the centuries in the West.
So I've heard in the past, and I will just admit I'm not super well versed in the intricacies of Eastern Orthodox theology, but I had heard it stated, and I can't remember where, or maybe I read it just briefly in a book, that our doctrines of original sin are quite different. Is this the case? And was there any issue in kind of making that journey away from Eastern Orthodoxy into Lutheranism then?
So original sin definitely gets described in different ways by different people. And it's a really good question because there's a rabidly anti-Western Orthodox theologian of the 20th century named John Romanides, who essentially makes such a straw man of Western theology that it's really just completely over the top. But a lot of people read him because he sounds so strongly pro-Eastern, and he's like, Augustine ruined everything, the filioque ruined everything, original sin ruined everything. It's just all of this nonsense of the Western Church. But it's really interesting that if a person looks at actual Eastern canonical texts like the Jerusalem Synod of 1672, you find them teaching original sin. They talk about, for example, in Decree 6 of Dositheus, that only what the divine justice inflicted upon man as a punishment for the original transgression, such as sweats and labor, afflictions, we believe man in falling by the original transgression to have become comparable and similar to the beasts. We have this idea of original sin or ancestral sin. Decree 16. Therefore, baptism is necessary even for infants, since they also are subject to original sin. And I mean, I can look up the original Greek of this text here, and it just happens to be there. So when they talk about ancestral sin and try to affirm it as something other than and opposed to original sin, it's really, in my opinion, it's just not true. It's just not true. I'm trying to see if I can find this Greek of this quickly enough to be helpful. No, call it propatorikis amartias, and so we have this like original sin. You can translate that as original sin. So it's not like they were making this distinction in the 17th century and saying we're different. No, and that's why Callistos Ware, the famous Eastern Orthodox apologist, who is a famous who's also formerly an Anglican, does these kind of Anglican-style moves, like the liberal Anglican who tries to say that, for example, the 39 Articles aren't a binding document, they're just a historical document. I think the ELCA will do like a similar sort of thing with the Book of Concord. It's not like a binding document, it's just like a historically important document.
Right.
And so he kind of did a similar thing with Eastern Orthodoxy in an attempt to rescue it by calling, this centuries in the Eastern Orthodox Church the Latin captivity, so that the Jerusalem Council of 1672 was just a Latin captivity of the church. But if the claim of the Eastern Orthodox Church is true, that they're the one and only church, which is what they say if you're not even in an Eastern Orthodox church under an Eastern bishop, you're not even a Christian. If that's true, then it's not possible that they ever had a Latin captivity. And they can't have it both ways.
So in your studies, the Augsburg Confession was sent to the Eastern Church. I think rejected. But did you see any from discussion of that from the Eastern side in your studies on what they rejected and why?
Well, of course, you have the famous interaction between Patriarch Jeremiah II and Jacob Andre in the latter half of the 16th century, and they had kind of like a back and forth correspondence, and it didn't seem like and I haven't reviewed this particular text in a while now, but there were certain things that, interestingly enough, they agreed on. One was the atonement. And another, I don't think they disagreed on original sin either. But of course, what they would have disagreed on was justification. They can't hear faith. It's important to understand how the East formally defines faith. Because we might say, like when they say, for example, that it is not the correlative of faith. In other words, it's not the righteousness of Christ that justifies us, but the faith which is in us. They actually give a formal definition of what they mean by the word faith. And so we'll just double check exactly how they say that. They say that we believe that no one can be saved without faith. And here's what they say. They say, by faith, we mean the right notion that is in us concerning God and divine things. So it's the notitia, right? If we're looking at doing the Latin side, they define faith as essentially just having right theology. By faith, we mean the right notion that is in us concerning God and divine things, which, working by love, so these ideas that you work out through love, that's what justifies us with Christ. So they really don't even have the idea of faith as trust, as fiduciary trust.
Yeah. Or as assent to what is true.
Yeah, it's just an assent to what is true. That's it. Just you have the right ideas. So essentially they're saying that a demon who understands that God is God, who understands that Jesus really did rise from the dead, those are the right notions concerning God and divine things. So the only thing that's keeping a demon from being saved is that he doesn't do good works.
Yeah.
So I would call that a demonic faith, a demonic false faith.
Yeah.
Just as a default, not that I'm trying to accuse them all of believing this way or something, but that's actually their canonical position.
Yeah. And that's often the case that you have, what is on paper and what is actually believed in the individual.
Yeah. And so many converts from the Protestant churches who have heard the gospel, who believe the gospel, they'll go into the Eastern Orthodox Church, and because of the strategic silence, the strategic use of silence by the Eastern Orthodox Church, they'll hear in the liturgy the biblical language. And so whatever is missing because of that silence, they'll supply it subconsciously. And so they'll think, the Orthodox Church is fine. I believe the gospel. And it becomes a situation where they trap themselves in it, again, through that strategic use of silence that the Eastern Orthodox Church uses.
So that's very interesting. I'm curious to hear what you think we, as the Lutheran Church, what could we benefit from what you were, the good things that were given to you and taught within the Eastern Orthodox communion that we ourselves could benefit from. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind is the deep and formative influence of the liturgy. Mm-hmm. High liturgy is a good thing. And because we have the gospel and we properly distinguish between the law and the gospel, we don't suffer the same risk that the Eastern Orthodox Church does.
Okay.
So I think that is one thing that we could learn from them, to essentially embrace our culture, our Lutheran culture, connecting all the way back through Gerhard, through Chemnitz, through Martin Luther, but even back earlier, going all the way back through Augustine and even the earliest church fathers, like actually understanding ourselves as not a merely 16th century phenomenon. We are the Catholic Church. We are the Western Catholic Church. And if we don't embrace that identity, we end up selling ourselves short as a 16th century phenomenon that really doesn't sound like it sounds like a new start. It sounds like an upstart, but we're not.
Yeah.
Our Book of Concord, we can't read one page without coming across a positive reference to the fathers.
Yeah.
And that's because that's enshrined in our identity as Western Catholic Christians.
Yeah.
And so I would say that's something that we can learn from them, is to embrace our identity as identity, Lutheran art, Western Catholic art, architecture, aesthetics and beauty, those sorts of things, beautiful liturgy, the value and meaning of our ceremonies, and being able to to really have the patience and the fortitude to be able to understand that we actually shoot ourselves in the foot when we start negotiating on a lot of these points and giving them up just because of, well, kids don't do it that way anymore, or people want this, or people want that. Because in reality, what Christians really want, in my opinion, is they want to know what Christianity is, and they want to know what Christianity practices.
Yeah.
And if we keep capitulating to culture and saying, well, let's negotiate this theological doctrine, and let's negotiate this practice just to kind of conform to modern sensibilities or prejudices, now all of a sudden we're acting like we don't know what we believe, and we don't even know what we practice.
Mm-hmm.
I think. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
That's so true. I mean, just having the chutzpah, right, to be who we know we are. One of my good friends, Will Whedon, always talks about how we are the true Western Catholic Church, cleansed through the crucible of the Reformation.
Yeah, and so that Reformation becomes no different than Maximus the Confessor, who had his tongue chopped out and his hand cut off for the sake of the two wills of Christ. Athanasius, who suffered however long of an exile and running for his life, trying to defend the divinity of Christ. You know, we don't see Nicaea as an upstart new thing. That was a confirmation of the church. We don't see Maximus as being innovative. That was a confirmation of true theology. And I think when we see that the doctrine of justification by faith alone, or by grace alone, through faith alone, we can trace that all the way from First Clement to the Epistle to Diognetus, and on all the way through Ambrosiaster or Augustine, or and so on, and say, look, it just happened to be that in the 16th century, the ambiguity that existed in the relationship between faith, justification, and works, that ambiguity was no longer sustainable. That God called up Martin Luther and the reformers, Melanchthon, Chemnitz, Andrea, all of these people. God called them up, or out, or moved them to make this necessary clarification so that what has always been believed, taught, and confessed in the church can no longer suffer the ambiguity, because the Roman Catholic Church had just abused that ambiguity to no good end.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very good.
Another area, if I may, that I think could be, and maybe I'm too bold to say this, is even some of the spirituality of what came prior to the Reformation as well, like Martin Luther, John Arndt, like their references to earlier forms of piety, whether that's the Theologia Deutsch or even pieties that Augustine would have known or found familiar in kind of according to their theological anthropology. And I think some of those aspects and dimensions of Christian life could have some value as well to sort of defend us against secularism. I think one of the problems or challenges that happens in our churches when we preach freedom in the gospel in a certain sort of way, people say, I'm free, I don't have to do anything, except I do have to pay my bills and go to work on time if I expect to be able to pay those bills, and I do have to brush my teeth, and I do have to comb my hair, and I do have to take a shower, and I do have to call this person back, and I do, like, there's many things that we kind of have to do in a secular sense. But if our thoroughgoing idea of spiritual life is such that we don't, quote unquote, have to do anything, we end up kind of bottoming out and not even having spiritual practices and just replacing it all with just secular life.
Yeah.
And I think when we understand the value of like morning and evening prayers, or even the hours of prayer, as some Lutheran, some of our like the treasury of daily prayer, if I'm saying the name right, that we have in the LCMS, like finding real deep value in those as non-superfluous. I don't want to say necessary, because the freedom we have in the gospel is true, real, good, and we have to defend it to the death and even die for the freedom that we have under the gospel. But we don't want to abuse that freedom such that we experience no spiritual disciplining in our lives.
Right. Yeah. And there has been in the past, I mean, as far as I can remember, let me put it that way, kind of a downplaying of spiritual discipline and discipline within the church. I think some of that is coming back, but finding, instead of making up ways, looking back to the history of the church to see what practices can be employed towards good ends would obviously be probably the most solid course of action.
Yeah, even if it's weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, chanting of the Psalms, or whatever it is, I think you're right.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a joy hearing kind of your story and the things that you struggled with, and really how impressive it was, the depth that you went into kind of figuring these things out. So often you run across people who may have doubts or lingering, but they don't put the work in. They haven't put the reading in. And I'm super appreciative that you took the time to do that for all of our benefit.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. The only thing I can claim for myself is that I'm a sinner and I have a book addiction. So if I saw that somebody talked about something that was, related to one of these questions, I probably spent too much money on that book.
Well, good. It's been a real pleasure, and blessed Epiphany-tide to you and yours.
Yes, and to you also, Pastor Jason. Thank you again.
All right. God bless.
God bless.